Okay, AMP1 students, we're going to continue talking about the microscopic anatomy of our skeletal muscle cells. So the next objective that we're going to focus on is to describe those myofibrils and talk about their anatomy. And again, this is where we need to go because we are going to talk about the physiology, and it's these structures that are involved in the physiology of how a skeletal muscle cell contracts. All right, so in this picture that we looked at in the last video, we talked about the myofibrils. So we have this like long cylindrical skeletal muscle cell. So everything has the shape of being long and cylindrical. That's kind of the theme for skeletal muscle cells. So we have these long cylindrical skeletal muscle cells, and then inside of them are these long cylindrical myofibrils. And then if we take one of those myofibrils, those long and cylindrical, and we look to see what it's made up of these long cylindrical myofilaments. So they're called filaments because they're teeny tiny. And so it is these little myofilaments in their anatomy that's very important in how a skeletal muscle contracts. So we're going to look at a picture where we zoom in on these and we look at what proteins make them up. But first, in this picture, I want you to notice that what they did was they have this myofibril, and they kind of showed how the sarcoplasmic reticulum and the T-tubules wrap around the myofibril. So every myofibril has these structures wrapping around it. Over here, though, they took the sarcoplasmic reticulum and transverse or T-tubules off so we could see what this myofibril looks like. So if we look at these myofibrils, we will notice that they have these repeating units. So we can see this little, they call this a Z line or Z disc. You see these little zigzaggy line here made up of proteins. And then we have another one here. And if you look between those, you'll see that we have these proteins and then these proteins in this little area, proteins, and then you'll notice that next to this structure of the myofibril, we have another structure that looks exactly the same. And then if we look at the next part, again, we have a structure that looks exactly the same. So the myofibrils are repeating units of these little structures that you see here. And these little structures have a name. They're called sarcomeres. So sarco and then mere. So one of these is called a sarcomere, and then this one is also called a sarcomere. And that's what myofibrils are made up of, is the arrangement. And the sarcomere is just kind of, myofibrils are actually made up of myofilaments, these little protein filaments. But the way that these protein filaments are arranged in the myofibril, we get these repeating units called sarcomeres. So the sarcomere is made up of both types of myofilaments that are in here. So these are the structures that that you'll need to be able to identify using these pictures. So there'll be a picture where you have to identify sarcolemma, sarcoplasm, mitochondria, nucleus, myofibrils, sarcoplasmic reticulum, transverse tubules, as well as sarcomeres. And then we'll go into another picture. There's one more picture where you need to be familiar with the anatomy and identifying, and that will also be a picture that could show up on the test. So we want you to learn the microscopic anatomy very well so we can go on and talk about the physiology. There's a few things, though, you'll notice that I won't ask you. So I won't ask you the triad or the terminal cisternae. So there's a few things that I don't feel like we really need to memorize to understand the physiology. So, okay, so I'm going to go down a little farther to the myofilaments. So this is just like a smaller version of that picture that we were just looking at. And those are the little myofilaments. So if we pull those little myofilaments out and magnify them, this is what they look like. And again, there's two types. There is one called a thick myofilament, or just thick filament. So it looks like this. We have these like long linear, these are proteins, long linear proteins. And then they, at the end of them, they have like a head structure on them. So we call these the heads. And this protein, these proteins, so you can see the one molecule of myosin, that's the name of this protein, looks like this. And then we put a bunch of them together and then we get this thick filament. So it's much thicker, so that's why they call it thick myofilament. But it's one of the myofilaments that are within the myofibril. So, and then it's made up of myosin. That's the molecule that the thick myofilaments are made up of. And the little heads that you see up here, if we look at them a little bit closer, you'll know that there's little areas on them where things will bind to them. So we haven't talked about actin yet, but there's another protein on our thin filament that will bind to the binding site here, which is called the actin binding site. And then there's also a little binding site for ATP. So we'll talk about what ATP does when it binds to that little site there, as well as what happens when actin binds there. All right, so you should be able to identify the myosin heads and know that this is a thick filament. And then be able to identify the actin binding site. I don't think I asked you about the ATP binding site, just the actin one. All right, and then the other myofilament that's part of our myofibril is the thin myofilament, or just thin filament. Now this one is a little more, has more proteins. So this one was just myosin protein. This one actually has 3 proteins that you need to be familiar with, and they color-coded them, and they are different shapes, so you can see the difference in them. So the first one that I'll talk about is these red proteins that are kind of linked together, kind of like pearls of a necklace is kind of what it reminds me of. Those are the actin proteins, so they're red here. So that's considered actin, the actin protein. And there's 2 strands of them, and they're kind of twisted along each other. So you need to be familiar with identifying the actin. And then this green protein, it's not really green, but it helps to, in diagrams, to draw them different colors. The green is more of a linear protein. And you'll notice that it's wrapping its way around the actin, and that's called tropomyosin. So that protein is called tropomyosin. So we need to be familiar with that and be able to identify it if I show a picture of this and point to that one. And then the other protein is this blue, and it definitely has a different shape to it. Kind of looks like a little snowman without a top of his head. So that each one of those proteins, it's called troponin. And troponin, actually the little part that's kind of off there is where the calcium binds there. So that's the calcium binding site. So there's kind of a reason why it kind of looks like a little concave area. And then something that's a little hard to see, but hopefully you can see that these actin molecules, just like the myosin head had a little actin binding site, the little actin have a myosin binding site. And so when we're not contracting, when the muscle is not contracting, this tropomyosin kind of blocks, kind of like lays over top of those myosin binding sites. So that way you can't get these 2 binding. But whenever muscle contraction, we want it to happen, then the tropomyosin will actually move out of the way, and then that'll allow for the myosin head to bind to this myosin binding site on actin. So those are so on this picture, you want to be able to identify actin, tropomyosin, troponin, and then the myosin binding sites. So there's a couple of other structures that are a little more specific, but again, don't feel like we need to know those to understand the physiology, so I don't ask those specifically. All right, so that is our anatomy that we will need to become very familiar with this week, so that way when we start talking about the physiology next week, we'll be ready to go. So in the next video, I will talk a little bit about the motor unit and a little bit about our neuromuscular junction, probably do a little bit of the nervous system, and then that'll be all for the week, and then next week we'll get into the details of the physiology. So I'll see you in the next video.